Greg Macainsh, Skyhooks. What was it, Uncanny X-Men? Where will we be in 50 years? I never thought we'd be sitting around actually discussing getting to the 50-year break, but here we are, 50 years since.
Yeah, well, that's a bonus in itself.
You would have been in your early 20s when Living in the 70s was first released. What did people who were 74 think of the album back then?
I don't know if I knew anyone that was 74 back then. So,
grandparents, old uncles, aunts.
Grandparents had gone. I had an aunt who I think took a keen interest in what I was doing, but never ventured an opinion about it. I suspect that they wouldn't have liked it, and that was sort of reflected in the commercial radio broadcasters' ban of the number of songs on the record.
Yeah, which is quite funny when you think about it by today's standards, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't think they'd go out of their way to make an official edict. There was a time when they used to put stickers on albums as well. But now I think you've got to be a real extremist to get banned. But generally, you'd get ignored, I think.
Well, I was working in radio in the late 70s, and I do recall the notifications coming in. There was an official notification saying you can no longer play this song, and they'd put the lyric as to why. But if we go back just before you released Living in the 70s, there was Paul McCartney's Uncle Albert that was beeped because you couldn't say bloody on the radio at that point.
Yeah.
So that puts us all into perspective. I guess when Skyhooks came along, there was nothing like Skyhooks prior to Skyhooks. So what were you basing the band around?
Well, that basically, I'd seen a lot of bands. I used to go out all the time, and there was nothing locally that kind of took my fancy particularly. So I had the idea of to create something that was the kind of band I'd like to go and see. And I used to go to all the overseas gigs at Festival Hall, and remember being impressed by Gary Glitter's stage show and lots of other people. But the local band that I really liked was Daddy Cool, because they had a bit of a show and it was kind of fun. So I guess that was the subconscious blueprint for Skyhooks.
Well, and then that overlapped with Ross Wilson coming in and producing those.
Yeah, well, that was, he obviously took an interest. And the very first version of Skyhooks with Steve Hill singing and Peter Starkey and Peter Inglis, we played a show at the Melbourne University refectory for the union night, and we were supporting Ross's band Mighty Kong at the time. So that's where I first met Ross person to person.
And you'd already performed on Sunbury. I think that was January 1974. Living in the 70s, the single didn't come out until August 1974, but there were a couple of songs like Hey, What's the Matter and Love on the Radio that were played at Sunbury. I guess, that would have been the premiere to a lot of people who were in that audience at the time, hearing those songs for the first time.
Yeah, well, I mean, we were doing a lot of gigs before we recorded the album, and they were all original songs, so we were not a covers band at all. So people would have heard those songs live for the first time, not just at Sunbury, but all the other places we used to play.
It was refreshing because you came along. It was more than just being uniquely Australian in lyrical content. It was also uniquely Melbourne. Balwyn, Carlton, Toorak. I mean, those places had never been named in songs before. Yeah,
well, that's a device that Ray Davies had and Bob Dylan had and Chuck Berry had, to mention the places they knew about. So I thought, were there any places that I knew of, that I'd frequented, that had a bit of a cachet to them? And those particular suburbs they were more than just a place name, certainly in my mind anyway.
Yeah, I think it wasn't just place names that we were identifying with. The lyrical content, I'm living in the 70s, I've just caught another disease, was, like the fear of the boogeyman back in the late 70s, wasn't it, for a lot of teenagers, young adults?
Yeah, different kind of boogeyman. But I guess that was just the song that it turned up before the recording session. It was one of the last ones that I'd come up with before we went into the studio, and it became, the theme song.
An anthem for, so many anthems, came from this band. We're also very close to the end of the Vietnam War. As Skyhooks were developing. Whatever happened to the revolution? There's a horror movie right there on the TV. Was that reflecting the news at the time? It was almost, lyrically, it was almost editorial or opinion about what was happening in the news at the time.
Well, I think all of us at that time were directly affected by the Vietnam War, because they had conscription. I was in the draft. Everybody was, and your birthday got picked out of a barrel, and you had to go into the army. And so there was a great, amount of fear amongst us 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, that was your future, and you didn't know what was going to happen to you, whether you were going to be drafted or you were going to then or miss out. And luckily, I missed out, but some of my friends, not the case. And so it was a very, very intense time, and it affected people personally, and not just the people involved, but their families as well.
And so, therefore, was that a direct line to the inspiration?
Well, I think whatever happened to the revolution was sort of questioning what happened to all this sentiment once the politics changed, and people went back to their normal lives. They got stoned and drifted away.
You had a very, dominant image within the band right from the start with the album cover. The white suit, the white glasses, the white hat, and you're right at the front of that album cover. Did that solidify the image that you had with the band?
I don't think I was that happy with that depiction, but everybody seemed to be fine with the cover, so that's the way it went. It wasn't a conscious sort of choice on my part. Obviously, that's how the graphic artist saw the band.
But it became effectively your costume on stage after that.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, if you look at the old photographs, I didn't always wear a white suit and a hat. There was a whole bunch of other costumes, but that was the one that was, I guess, the most cohesive, and the one that you could see from a distance. If the band was playing outdoors and you were 300 meters away, you could probably say, oh, there's that guy in the white suit.
You didn't write every song on the album. One was written by Red, Smart. And Red actually got to do one on the next album and the album after that. And then I think Freddie had one on the fourth album. Were the other guys presenting songs? Why were you the main songwriter for the band when there were clearly other songwriters within the band?
Well, I guess that was a choice the producer would have picked what songs he thought were right for the record, and Red tends to be a bit contrapuntal at the best of times, so not all of his stuff I didn't think was Skyhooks as well, but definitely smart. It had the humor and the double entendres, and so that fitted very well in the Living in the 70s context. And I was quite prolific, I think, at the time.
If we go back to the signing of the band on Mushroom Records, at the time, Mushroom Records wasn't the juggernaut that it was today. And I would probably argue that Skyhooks made Mushroom. I know Michael in his, when he was around, would argue the opposite, that Mushroom made Skyhooks. Was it a bit of both?
Well, I think, Mushroom, I'd heard they didn't have a lot of money, and there was no precedent for selling records and making a profit, really, in Australia by Australian companies. I mean, Daddy Coolshaw, they sold a few records, and Billy Thorpe sold a few, but it really wasn't, serious amounts. And Mushroom, Michael, he invested, I think the Living in the 70s album might have cost $10,000 to $15,000, and at that time you could buy a 2-bedroom flat in East Malvern. So by today's dollars, it was probably $700,000, which was a massive amount of money to invest in an album. We did it quickly within 3 weeks, but that was studio time was expensive back then. It was like 100 and something bucks an hour in 1974 money. So it was a very expensive process, and Michael took the risk. I think some of his business partners thought he was crazy, but it paid off, and probably just as well. Otherwise, Mushroom would have perhaps gone bankrupt. But Michael was the sort of guy, as you know, that he was a fighter, and he would have promoted something else that worked. And so we all just got lucky at the same time.
The second album, Ego Is Not a Dirty Word, came in quick succession to Living in the 70s. I think they were only 9 months apart. Were all of those songs written together at the same time?
There was a couple of songs on Ego that we tried in the studio for Living in the 70s, and they didn't quite work at the time. But by the time we got to do the Ego album, we were a better studio band. And I think Love on the Radio, that was certainly around from the very beginning. That ended up on the Ego album. And I think I think there might have been the other song called The Other Side, I think, that was around from the very beginning of Skyhooks. So, and the rest was sort of, I was writing, pretty much all the time, and knew that we would have to do another album. So I made sure I was prepared like a good Boy Scout.
Down at the other end of Skyhooks, after Shirl left, there was the Hot for the Orient album with Tony Williams, the new lead singer of the band at the time. I kind of liked that album. I know we played Over the Border at 2ST in Nowra when I was working at a radio station there. I don't think that album gets the accolades it deserves. There were some very good songs on that record, but it didn't do anything. But the world had moved on, hadn't it? I mean, by the time we got to 1980, we'd gone through the punk era. We were starting to get into the new wave era, and we're just before the new romantic era when the Duran Durans and the Culture Clubs and all of that came along. Was Skyhooks just out of place at that time? Is that why the album fell through the cracks?
Look, it's not my job to make overarching comments about where Skyhooks sit in the lexicon, but because when you're in a band, that's not your focus. It's just to to do what's in front of you and to create, more stuff. And it was always going to be difficult without Shirl, but the fact was that we wanted to keep playing. Bob Spencer had joined the band, and that was a new sort of sound and approach. So we thought we'll get another singer and do more. And those performances and that time, from a personal level, it was pretty enjoyable. But the records didn't do sales-wise what the other stuff had done, and I think Michael had lost sort of a bit of interest by then, but he had plenty of other things to do as well.
There was also then, years later, a really big success. Jukebox in Siberia came along. That was the #1 hit in Australia. Did that take you by surprise?
Yeah, well, it's quite unprecedented, and we'd only had one #1 hit single in horror movies, so to repeat that was, there was no real precedent for that, and I think it was the only Australian #1 in 1990, according to some people. So, we were definitely surprised.
1999, there was the Lost album finally released. Did the Lost album ever have a title?
No, I mean those songs were recorded in 1994 or 5, I think. We were going to do a tour with Daddy Cool, and the idea was, each band would contribute, half a dozen songs to an album, sort of a joint effort, if you like. And but the tour ended up not occurring, so those songs just sat for a few years until I sort of convinced the record company that we should put them out, and that's what happened. And then a couple of years later, Shirley was gone, unfortunately.
Why hasn't there ever been a Greg Macainsh solo album?
I don't know the answer to that. It's a matter of, I've had other things to do. It's not beyond the realms of impossibility, but Skyhooks will certainly occupied a lot of my time, and after in the last 10, 20 years, I've done other things, which I think has been good. Being a musician can be pretty one-dimensional at times, and you wonder what else there is that might be of interest.
Like filling in your day standing in the back of a John Farnham video.
Well, yes, there was that period, and I also went to university and studied law for a number of years, and worked in that field for a while.
And contribute that back to the music industry and copyright.
Well, yeah, I was on the board of APRA and also the PPCA back in the early 2000s.
Will we see you on stage ever again doing anything musically?
I can't predict the future, but it's highly unlikely.
Because Bongo gets out there, and I guess, Bongo keeps the legacy alive in a certain way, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, yeah, he seems to enjoy playing the stuff that he was playing 50 years ago. So good on him.
And Laura makes a great Shirl.
I think she's moved on from what some people tell me, but I mean, the thing with Shirley had a particular sort of range, and that's not easily, simulated.
Well, it's nice to talk as two old blokes about the good old days.
Yeah.
Living in the 70s, 50 years ago. I can't believe it myself, sitting at home as a year 12 student watching Countdown and seeing you on TV then all those years ago. And here we are still talking about it.
Yeah. It's time flies.
Greg, great to talk to you.
Thanks, Paul.